thank you everyone for the invite to be here today. Thank you, Aris, as well, for what you shared. It's so lovely to be encouraged to use whatever we have. And in these days when everything is restricted and we feel we have a lot less, we still have something to use. So thank you, Aris, for that. I want to talk this morning from the book of Ruth. And if you have a Bible or it's on your phone or tablet somewhere, you might want to have it nearby, because obviously I'm not going to read the whole book of Ruth. I will read little sections of it as we go along, and maybe you'll read it later on just to refresh your memory. But I think we all love the book of Ruth, and I think when we read it and often when we hear people talk about it, we focus on Ruth and the character of Ruth. And of course, she is a lovely woman. She is a widow, and she leaves her home in Moab, and she accompanies her mother-in-law back to Bethlehem of Judah. And she cares for Naomi, she looks after her, she provides for her. And of course, God brings a husband along who is a redeemer for Naomi, but also a husband for Ruth. And it's a beautiful love story. And we love the character of Ruth. And I think Naomi is a different character. We see her as someone who's perhaps a bit bitter, who's complaining, and in a lovely love song, she strikes a minor key. And so we don't often look at the book of Ruth from the perspective of Naomi, but that's what I want to do briefly today. And I want us first of all to think about loss in relation to Naomi. And obviously, Naomi had lost an awful lot. She had suffered all kinds of losses in her life. When we're introduced to her at the beginning of the book, she is the wife of Elimelech and the mother of Mahlon and Chilion. And we know that she leaves the town where she lives, Bethlehem of Judah, which of course is the birthplace of Jesus. And the meaning of that is the house of bread. So she lived in a place where she had plenty. She had a husband, she had 2 sons, and she had a community of God's people around her. So she had everything. She had everything she wanted, everything she needed. But then her life began to unravel, and famine struck. And Naomi and her family decide to move from Bethlehem of Judah, the house of bread, to Moab. And those of you who know the story of the Old Testament will know that Moab was the result of an incestuous relationship between Lot and one of his daughters. So Moab was also an enemy of Israel. And Paul Miller, who has written a wonderful book on the story of Ruth called A Loving Life, you may want to pick that up, says this: ancient readers would have been intrigued and possibly troubled by the family's move to Moab. The Moabites were the result of an incestuous relationship between Lot and one of his daughters. And so there may have been a bit of a question mark. Why would they have gone to Moab of all places? Of course, they were looking for bread. It was a time of famine, and they were in search of what they needed. But of course, if you know the story, you know that when they were in Moab, further losses struck Naomi, and she lost first her husband and then her 2 sons. I cannot imagine what that was like, and I hope none of you can imagine what that was like, to have lost a husband and 2 sons. It was unimaginable loss, and more so in the culture, the traditional culture of the Near East, where your sons were everything to you, because your daughters left home and set up their own families. Your sons stayed with you and provided for you. And so even more so than in our culture today, it would have been absolutely devastating to lose her sons. The sons would not only have been the ones who would have provided financially for Naomi, but of course they would have hopefully carried on the family line. And now there was no one to carry on the Ephrathite line. That family had come to an end in the clan. And that also was a bitter, bitter loss. So there were so many losses stacked one on top of the other for Naomi. Her dreams died along with her husband and her two sons. And so she is left alone to mourn her losses. And in Ruth chapter 1, verse 5, we read this: the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. She was left without. And I think it's such a summary in 2 words of Naomi's life at this stage: left without, left destitute. She has had a series of losses. She's living outside of Israel, and that was already a partial death. And Paul Miller suggests now, with the death of her husband and 2 sons, Naomi's life is functionally over. So she has suffered many, many losses. And I want you to stop and just think, what losses have you suffered? We're living in the midst of a global pandemic. You don't need me to remind you. And Iris has spoken beautifully of what God can do in the midst of our losses. But I want you to think just what losses you have suffered in your life. I think it's only the very young who don't know what loss is. I think all of us will not have to go too far in our stories before we find losses. From my own story, I look back to a broken engagement many years ago, and I look back to losing our first child by miscarriage. And I look back to a depression that I suffered at the beginning of our ministry when we lived in Switzerland. And I'm sure you can identify, you too have suffered losses. And in the middle of the pandemic, we are suffering all kinds of losses. Sometimes we're more aware of those than others. As Iris has reminded us, we've lost the freedom to invite people over our own doors. We can't invite people to dinner. We can't even have a coffee with a friend. We don't have the opportunity to catch up with friends, to catch up with kids, to catch up with grandkids. There have been many, many losses during this last year. And of course, some people have lost their health, and some people have lost loved ones. And of course, that is the deepest loss of all. So there have been lots of losses that we can identify. And so I think we can all identify in some measure with Naomi as she sets back to head back home to Bethlehem of Judah and leaves Moab behind, where she has suffered so many losses. As she sets off, her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, they decide they're going to go with her. And for them, that was a very courageous decision because, of course, they were leaving what was home for them, and they were leaving their own culture to head off to something they didn't know, a foreign country, a foreign land, foreign cultures, and they were going to go with Naomi. But Naomi, probably in this conversation, begins to pull back the veil a little bit of the bitterness that's in her heart. And she says to them in 1 verse 13, "It's exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." It's a very emotional exchange. All 3 women are crying, and Naomi is trying to persuade the 2 women to go back. Orpah is kissing Naomi, and Ruth is clinging to her. And Ruth's interpretation of the tragic events of her life is this: God's hand has gone out against me. No wonder she thought that. No wonder, because she was living in the midst of such grief. As we know, Orpah is persuaded to go back home, but Ruth clings to her, and Ruth has decided she is going to go back with Naomi and she's going to accompany her. And of course, when they get back to Bethlehem, we have another insight into Naomi's heart. In Ruth chapter 1, verses 19 to 21, the women are all gathered. The whole village is stirred to see this woman who's come back with her daughter-in-law. And they say, "Is this Naomi?" They can't believe it. And she said to them, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. So this is her interpretation of events. God has brought calamity on her, God has brought her back empty, and God's hand has gone out against her. And we all try to interpret what's going on in our lives. We are interpreters, and we're all trying to make sense of what's going on around us. And this was Naomi desperately trying to make sense because she knew God. She had come from a place where the community around her worshipped God, and she knew God, but she was trying to interpret her life events in terms of the God she knew. And the two things didn't go together at this point in her life. So she's blaming God. God is responsible. He's brought calamity on her. His hand's gone out against her, and she laments. She laments to others about God, and that's key. She laments to others about God, and this makes her bitter, and it makes her turn in on herself to self-pity. I'm sure we've all been there as we try to grieve the things that we have lost. So how do we deal with our losses in a helpful way? I want to suggest today that Naomi turned from loss to lament, but not quite a biblical lament, because a biblical lament makes us turn to God. Naomi turned to others about God. She was almost there. But lament, when we look at it in a biblical sense, it makes us turn to God. So I don't know about you, but I'm not very good at lamenting in a biblical way. And when I look at lament in many of the Psalms, a third of them are actually laments. And probably Psalm 13 is one of the best well known. I look at that and I think, I'm not sure I know how to do that in a biblical way. This is what Psalm 13 says. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? That would have been a wonderful lament for Naomi. And it is a wonderful lament for us today in the middle of a pandemic, because if you're anything like me, you've wondered that. How long is this going to go on? And with every news brief that we get and every disappointment here in Northern Ireland, we've just heard this week that our lockdown will be extended another month. And with every disappointment, with every news brief, we think, how long is this going to be? And these are the words on the lips of the psalmist who laments to God. So he brings his lament to God. He's very honest about how he feels. But as with most of the Psalms of Lament, all actually except one of them ends with a reminder of the character of God. So we go from our feelings, our raw feelings, our emotions about our situation, to a reminder of the character of God. And that Psalm 13 is no exception. The psalmist ends the psalm by saying, I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he's dealt bountifully with me. So I think that's really, really helpful. Someone has said that lament is these two things: an honest cry of the heart, expressing the paradox between the pain of life and the promises of God. I love that. It's expressing the pain of life and the promises of God. And if ever there was a time when we needed to do that, it's now. I picture myself holding them in two hands, the pain of life in one hand and the promises of God in another. When you try to bring them together, they don't meet, but that's what lament is. And I would love to learn how to lament well in the biblical sense. So what about Naomi? Well, she laments about God and she comes back home. She comes back to Bethlehem. And I think we see a glimmer of hope here. I love this because it's a bit like now, we're still in winter, but there are little signs of spring. There are snowdrops popping up. There are little shoots of green, and there are signs of hope. And I suggest there are two little glimmers of hope. In chapter 1, verse 6, we're told that she'd heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. And so she decides to go back home. Now, we can be cynical and say, well, she's just going back home because of the food. And that may be true. But I think also she's going back home because she knows that is a place, well, that is the house of bread. But it's probably more than physical bread. It's the place where she knew God. It's the place where there's a community of people who worship God. And the other glimmer of hope we get is in 2 verse 20. So if you know the story, you know that when they get there, Ruth goes out to glean in the fields. She goes out to find food for her and Naomi. And when she comes back and tells Naomi about what's happened there and how God is beginning to provide for them, in 2 verse 20, Naomi says, "May he be blessed by the Lord," she's referring to Boaz, of course, "whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." So she's seeing the provision, but she's relating that back to God. It's not just, oh, Boaz is here and there's hope, but it's God's kindness has not forsaken us. And I love that because it's as if the hope in Naomi's grieving heart is being rekindled. And she's beginning to see that God is still there and God is still providing. I love to think of Naomi as someone who's searching through the broken pieces of a precious vase. They're lying in pieces around her, and she's looking for God in the broken pieces of her life. And she's beginning to find him as she heads home. I think there's something about heading home. And there's something about our longing for home. Our longing for home is actually a longing for God and all that he provides for us. And as we get older, we probably long more for home. But I think of Luke 15 and the prodigal son and how he said, when he decided to head home, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father." So like Naomi, he decides to head home because he knows that's the place of provision. That's the place where his father is. So how does God respond to Naomi? She's desperately looking for hope. She's maybe not quite at a biblical lament yet, but she's heading home. She has got there and she's looking for God. She's recognizing that there are signs of God's kindness. Paul Minner suggests this in the context of the whole book of Ruth. Ruth's love is God's response to Naomi's lament. Ruth's love is God's response to Naomi's lament. God often uses human agents to show his love. And so Ruth is an incredible example of God's love. Ruth comes and completely unselfishly gives up any dream, humanly speaking, of finding a husband when she decides to accompany Naomi back to Bethlehem. And when she gets there, she leaves Naomi at home and she's the one who goes out and looks for work and provides for Naomi. She's a beautiful illustration of God's love. And incidentally, I think when those around us are grieving, they probably don't need our theology about God's love. They need us to be the hands and feet of Jesus. They need us to show them God's love before they're able to listen to our theology. And that's exactly what Ruth does for Naomi. So I want you to think for a moment, how have you processed the losses in your life? I don't know if you have ever tried to lament biblically. That may be something new for you. It's something new for me, but I'm trying to learn how to do that in a biblical way. I've noticed that in the pandemic, we vacillate between bemoaning our situation and complaining and grumbling. And then we think, well, we need to be thankful because we have so much compared to other people. And I think actually neither of those are awfully helpful. I think we need to be honest about how we feel on one hand, the pain of life, But then we need to look at the promises of God and hold those two things together. And that is what Lament says. That's what it does. Mags Duggan, in her book God Among the Ruins, has given us some guidelines on how to write a psalm of lament. And she says this form of worship, this offering up of our pain, honors God because it brings all that we are in the muddled mess of our lives and places it as an offering before God. So Naomi moved from loss to lament and finally to liturgy. Liturgy is simply when a community of God's people gather together to worship. And of course, the book of Ruth ends in a beautiful celebration. As we've seen, there was so much loss in Naomi's life, but there was also so much provision from God. And I want to sum up that provision of God in 4 C's. So first of all, there was the companionship of Ruth. As we've seen, God provided companionship for her through Ruth, and Boaz recognizes that. He says, all that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you didn't know before. That's 2 verse 11. So first of all, God provides companionship. Then God provides a beautiful community, and Naomi leaves Moab and comes back to that beautiful community. And when we're introduced to that community, we see Ruth going to the fields, and people are saying, may the Lord bless you. May the Lord be with you. It was a beautiful community to be part of. And of course, as part of that community, they were following the laws laid down by Moses, that they were to leave sheaves along the sides of the fields. They weren't to gather right to the edges, so that the poor, the widows, the orphans could gather those sheaves. And it was just a beautiful provision of God. So there was companionship, there was community, and then there was care. Of course, when Ruth comes to the field of Boaz, his offer for Ruth to stay in his fields and not go anywhere else is something that we appreciate on some level, but we probably don't understand the depths of it because we aren't part of that culture. But he was saying essentially, stay here where you'll be safe and I will take care of you. It was a beautiful provision of care for a widow who was very vulnerable and could have been abused in many different ways. So care, community, and companionship. And the final C is commitment. And of course, we love this, don't we? That Boaz finally is allowed to redeem Naomi and marry Ruth, because the kinsman who was first in line has given up his right to do that. And Boaz says to the whole village around him in Ruth chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, you're witnesses that this day I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I've bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You're witnesses this day. Wow. Such a huge commitment. Not just a redeemer, but not just a husband, but so many other things. The whole family line is now able to continue, and Boaz becomes the redeemer. And the women gather together to worship, and that's what liturgy is. The women have gathered around to worship and celebrate. And here's what they say in verses 14 and 15 of chapter 4. The women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without. Wow, do you remember at the beginning, we summed up Naomi's life as left without? Now they are blessing God who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is more to you than 7 sons and has given birth to him. So remember how in the beginning the story begins with words like famine, death, empty, and Naomi was left without. Now we have words like restorer of life, nourisher of your old age, birth, fruitfulness. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you without. So death is turned to life, emptiness is turned to fruitfulness, loss to restoration, sorrow to joy, and lament to liturgy. The community of women worship God around Naomi. And of course, this little baby who has been born is an ancestor of our Redeemer, the one who's turned our death to life, our emptiness to fruitfulness, our loss to restoration, our sorrow to joy, our lament to liturgy. He is an ancestor of our Redeemer. And as the village women gather around Naomi to worship God, so we are gathered today, gathered not physically, but gathered over Zoom to remember who God is as our Redeemer and to worship him. So again, I invite you to stop and think, how do you engage in liturgy? Do you worship God with other people? It may be in church. It probably won't be in a church building right now, but we can do it in all kinds of ways like we are doing this morning. Maybe you're part of a prayer group. Maybe you're part of a prayer cell. Maybe you meet with one other woman as you can. Maybe walking, praying together, maybe over Zoom or FaceTime or WhatsApp. But it's important that we get together and worship God together. So the story of Naomi's life is a story of bitterness, from bitterness to blessing. And as we've seen, she laments about God, she laments her losses, she becomes bitter, but in the end, she comes back home to God, and she is part of that liturgy, part of the celebration of who God is. I remember many years ago, actually, at the time of my broken engagement that I referred to at the beginning, I heard Brian Tatford, a missionary in the south of France, whom some of you may remember, and he was speaking at a conference about Jacob, the story of Jacob, and he said, God will bring the broken pieces of our lives together again if we bring them to him. God will put the broken pieces of our lives together again if we bring them to him. And for me, that was a powerful message at that moment of my life, a powerful message. And God really spoke that to me. And I just love to think that that's what God is doing in the story of Naomi. He's putting the broken pieces of her life together again when she brings them to him. Jess, if you can just put up the slide for me now, that would be great. I have a slide that's a picture of the Japanese art form of kintsugi. And it is the art of when a precious bowl is broken, instead of throwing it out and discarding it, this art form will repair the broken crack with gold lacquer. So that not only is the bowl restored, but it is actually something even more beautiful than it was in the beginning, because now it has a story. And I think that is a beautiful picture. Thank you very much, Jess. That's wonderful. You can see the beautiful bowl that has been repaired with gold lacquer. And I think that is just a beautiful picture of what God does in redemption. Making someone who's been broken even more beautiful than before, because they are showing his beauty and they are showing the beauty of their Redeemer. That's my prayer for all of us today, that we will allow God to do that with our losses, that we will learn to lament, and then we will learn liturgy as we worship God together. Thank you so much.